And we know how Bitcoin can help with demand response and flexible load. We know that you need to connect money back to energy. We know where this is going, and we know that the government need to start taking notice, and we're trying to tell them, but they're not getting it. Those two things together, we should be all over this.
And we have people on our team who remain anon, but we have a sort of general rule of thumb that anyone who's interacting with regulators, politicians, publishing stuff needs to be happy with being in public. And at some point we'll make ourselves irrelevant once what we want to achieve has been achieved, and then we can disappear again.
It kind of baffles me that since the global financial crisis, 2008, and then eventually the vote with Brexit has encouraged a lot of banks to then offshore their City and Canary Wharf operations, that with the pedigree of this city, let alone the country, as being financial trade capital of the world, that they haven't recognised Bitcoin as being an opportunity in line with the country's history. All right. Suze and Freddie, welcome.
Thank you for having us. Very nice to be here.
It's a great pleasure to host you guys. I want to give greater voice and a platform to British voices, because there's a lot going on here, and especially in Europe in general as well. So it's a great pleasure to host you guys today at my studio. I love saying that every time I have someone in here.
It's a lovely studio.
We
were admiring all your hard work, and as we were saying earlier, it's such a nice pleasure to meet you in person. Been following you for years, and
I really appreciate that. It's I guess in doxing, there's quite a bit of trepidation before you do that, and it's eventually you come out and it's
so
nothing
why did
really
you
to
dox
it.
yourself?
That's a really good question, and I thought about it. I struggled with it for a long time. But ultimately, I think the potential to fulfill the potential of this brand, I had to actually expand into various channels. Like a newsletter, I could do that anonymously. A podcast, I don't think so. And I think a podcast is a significant part of the vision for Bitcoin Archive. And I wasn't sure that I could do it in any other way. I didn't really want to toy with hosting something just audio only. I feel like that would have been a half effort.
Or wearing a GIMP mask.
Yeah. Well,
some people don't like that.
Yeah, masks in general. I wasn't really sure that would work. So
There are other alternatives
oh yeah, do tell.
to GIMP masks.
Well, you could go V for Vendetta, but
That would be much better.
But if you're a Pulp Fiction fan, it's hard not to be a fan of the GIMP.
Very. Yeah.
I do love that movie. So I guess it was just, I think I have an obligation to fulfill the potential of this brand, and one of that, a significant part of that was a podcast, and a significant part of that would have been video podcasting as well. So I took a long time considering that. I think it was probably 2 years into it when I realized, I think we have something here, but I don't know how to fulfill that. I don't know that I can commit to the vision that was kind of the obvious, like it's an obvious thing to say you've got a brand and launch a newsletter. It's an obvious thing to say you've got a brand, launch a podcast, but okay, what's going to be the format? Can I commit to those formats? And so here we are now. I've sort of made peace with the fact that my identity will be known in public, or at least my face, and I'm okay with that. I can deal with that. I can look after myself, and so if anybody wants to cause problems, then that's okay.
Yeah. No, it's a difficult decision. It's something that we've faced ourselves. I was anon for many years, following people rather than any output. But I think, as you say, it's not necessarily just about doing something commercial and maximizing the value of your brand, but without people speaking out on this, then the things that we wanted to say were not going to be said. And we have people on our team who remain anon, but we have a sort of general rule of thumb that anyone who's interacting with regulators, politicians, publishing stuff needs to be happy with being in public. And at some point we'll make ourselves irrelevant once what we want to achieve has been achieved, and then we can disappear again.
Yeah. I think doxing allows people to have a stronger personal connection with you as well. And especially the work you guys are doing, it helps build your credibility. I mean, I don't really need the credibility as such, like, because it's a brand as such, but I've noticed that more and more people are following who perhaps held off. And I remember probably around about 18 months into launching Bitcoin Archive, I was just burnt out, just completely burnt out. I think I've told the story of as soon as I started it, I was pretty much 16, 17, 18 hours a day for about 18, 19, 20 months. I just didn't take any time off. It was just, that's all I did day and night. And it had a cost. It burnt me out. It made me a little bit sort of edgy, reflexive, because of the daily minutiae and the loops, the mental loops that you're constantly going through, blocking, ignoring, whatever, and you get a lot of that during the day. And then before you know it, you're just really edgy and reflexive towards everything and everybody. And it's completely against sort of my persona. I'm a very relaxed, sort of chill guy. But I didn't realize that had crept up into my behaviors over, a year and a half or so. And so when I wrote sort of that post about what I come to realize had crept into my behaviors, I think a lot of people connected with that. And people who hadn't really followed me up until that point started following, quite prominent people and said, oh, it's not just a brand and a company, it's a real person behind that. Because people thought, how is this guy constantly posting and tweeting, like,
it is pretty impressive. How did you
all
do it?
hours of the day? I just did it.
Was it just you?
It was just me, and it's still just me. I mean, Helliand is my producer on this podcast, and he helps me on this. But until then, it was pretty much just me.
Because you're
for
pretty
all hours.
quick.
Yeah,
Very
had to
quick.
be. Yeah. Well, the thing that was forefront of my mind was I had to be first.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wasn't given value. That's how I felt. It's like,
It was my favourite. It is my favourite account.
oh, she let slip
No,
Freddie.
the reason- no,
She
no, no.
let slip Freddie.
Well, Freddie's my favourite account now. So.
Oh,
That's
Yeah.
right. It works.
well, we just all need to reciprocally be each other's favourite.
I'm not a fan of Twitter, you know that. I barely go
No,
on it.
that's okay. Look, I think when you're doing something and you're phenomenally, like, just fanatically obsessed about it, you have to have sort of one driving principle. And for me was I had to be first. I wanted to give a little bit of value to as many people as possible, but that was my driving principle. I had to be first. It's just no compromise.
You tweeted out one of my first articles, actually.
Did I?
Yeah, it was so exciting.
I
I
remember you telling me this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
why Bitcoin could help save the environment. It was in City AM.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. How do I remember? I don't know, but I just remember it. I remember that.
And
yeah.
it was, going back to the doxing thing, that I wrote an article about CBDCs just before that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told that I had to dox myself, otherwise I wouldn't be able to write about central bank digital currencies. And because I had an opportunity to write it in City AM, which was going out to the City of London, that was the reason why I decided to dox myself, because I thought it was more important to share that information than not.
That's okay. And what's been your experience doxing? Because I've only been about 10 days. My identity's been revealed just for about 10 days. So I haven't really had a long time to experience much. And, who knows how many people have watched the podcast at the moment.
I didn't know what you looked like until I saw the Max and Stacey
Yeah,
episode.
yeah. Not many people did. I think there was like Carla and Walker kept the secret for the longest time, and maybe like 3 or 4 others, and that was it. Yeah. But I was asking about your experience doxing. Have you had any experiences of note?
Not really. I find that the weirdest thing is when you're talking to somebody and you don't know if they know you, and you find out that they do, but you've had a whole conversation on the assumption that they don't.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And I find that really weird, because then it's not a level playing field. You don't feel like it's natural. It's difficult to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't explain it.
No, I know exactly what you mean. And there's the other aspect of it where they only know you through your social media, and there's this sort of parasocial imbalance of information where they have a greater level of familiarity and knowledge about you, and you know nothing about them but this, I guess, mutual concern with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, but what is the appropriate way to act respectfully towards this person? Because you don't want to like they're coming up to you and they're giving you this respect and this attention and acknowledgement. So you don't want to be disrespectful to anybody, but by the same token, you don't want to be disingenuous and pretend that you know them or you remember them from somewhere and you don't. So it's like, and it's going to be a balance of that. But I guess you can never get that 100% right, can you? As long as you respond decently to someone, sure.
And I think Susie gets this more than I do. I mean, being completely honest, the work I do is extraordinarily boring.
It really isn't. Everyone should listen to Freddie's recent FCA paper. It was brilliant. I listened to it twice. It's awesome.
We'll get into that.
Yeah,
you can tell us all about your.
But no, Susie got to the point where people stalk her online and then approach her at conferences. And so,
is that right?
That has happened a few times, yeah. And that's what I mean. It's really difficult to know because someone says, "Oh, hi," and you're talking to them, and then you find out they know everything about you, and it's very.
Hopefully, not where you live, though.
No, thank you.
But you don't realize how much of you is online, even through the controlled. Even if they're just on Twitter and just following you really closely, you don't realize how much of yourself you do put out there.
No, I just post something and then forget about it. And I don't know where it's gone or who's seen it or who's interacted with it. I don't really have any concept of that at all. I have no concept of anything outside me sitting in my little office working.
And not conscious of the bigger picture that you've painted out there for someone who's actually taking note of all the information.
Yeah, I have no clue. I can't. How do you register that? How you can't? And do you?
No. So I can't even keep track of the conversations that we've had. For example, in this studio, we have sometimes 2 and 3 hour conversations. I've only had, this might be like the 10th or the 11th interview that we've done. And so I'd often walk home thinking, did I say that part on camera or off camera? And I'll forget large chunks of the interview completely until I view it again. I'm just like, I hope I didn't say anything that was stupid. But I never walk away so far. I have not yet walked away from an interview with a feeling of regret. So I try to just be in the moment and give an honest and sincere
regret for something
reaction.
That you've said.
Yeah, I haven't. Yeah,
regret for the person that you've asked to come in.
No. I mean, regret. I'm very grateful for you visiting our studio, Susan. I don't think that's going to change in the course of this conversation. So just
there's a challenge.
Yeah. No, I've never left with a feeling of regret for anything that I've said during a conversation. So because I feel like I'm in the moment and I'm giving a sincere response or engagement to whatever the guest is saying. So I feel like if I was just in a coffee shop talking to that person, I'd have the same conversation. And that's what I want the audience to see as well. I'm not trying to put out a persona. This is me. Like if we were having this chat anywhere else, I'd be saying the exact same things. I'd be interrupting at the same inappropriate moments. And so like, this is just who I am. Yeah. So that's what I want. So far, I don't think I've misspoken to the point of regret. But I'm sure I'll have those occasions.
But it is a little bit unnerving that the opinions that you have today won't be the opinions that you have in a year, because it's good to change your mind.
And it will be misused against you.
Exactly.
Sure.
That's the one thing that I don't like about being recorded.
Yeah.
Because I change my mind all the time. In fact, I try to change my mind.
Yeah.
But this is what's really interesting about the podcast as a phenomenon. And I think it's one of the reasons that we're seeing more politicians begin to realize that in order to be taken seriously as a genuine person, coming on a podcast like this and showing that you're not a complete robot.
You've got to take that risk.
Yeah. Exactly.
Are you one of us or you're not?
And it's really interesting to see the effect that I think podcast exposure had on the US election last year.
Wow.
And then contrasting that, I mean, can you imagine, with the best in the world, Keir Starmer doing a long-form 2-hour podcast where he has to speak normally and give honest opinions about things?
Here's the thing, right? I think he's got the intellect to be able to do that.
Oh, yeah.
I just think he's so risk-averse, such a robot. To me, all politicians are eventually disappointing. But for a person who stands up in court and has to think on his feet, I know that a lot of what he does is scripted as well, but he has to think on his feet. If something happens, he's got to be right on it. Otherwise, he could lose a case. He could lose a major moment in a case, right?
Well, he was a good barrister. He, well respected in his field. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I mean, it's important you as a lawyer to give that context. So, he's obviously not a dimwit, but he doesn't trust himself in an unscripted, unstructured conversation, long form. And one of the reasons why I tried to have a conversational, long form, relaxed podcast is that people do feel comfortable enough to just be themselves, even if they enter with a little bit of anxiety or trepidation about what's it going to be like. They just realize, hey, it's just me and we're just having a conversation, and I'm only interested in what you really think and what you feel, and that's all we want out of you for the podcast. And so if that was only a 30-minute conversation, I think a lot of guests would come in and go, I hope I don't blow this. And I don't want that feeling for any guest. I want them to come in and just say, hey, we're just talking. That's it. And you're here, both of you, because you have an expertise. And I just want you guys to share that with us. And that's all. That's all. That's the entire premise of this podcast. Let's come and chat. Yeah.
That's a nice intro. You should sum that up and use it on the homepage.
Yeah. I guess that's quite a preamble to a podcast, isn't it? I think we've gone for about 15 minutes. But Suze, what is the name of the organisation? Because I confuse it all the time. It's Bitcoin Policy UK?
Yes. Do you call it BPI?
I do
Bitcoin
get it
Policy
confused.
Institute UK or something like that.
Something like that. So what's the exact name that you've founded a Bitcoin policy organisation? Give us the name, please.
Bitcoin Policy UK. And Freddie and I are both the co-founders.
Oh, you're both co-founders. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. And what is your role in that organisation?
So I'm the CEO and Freddie is the Chief Policy Officer.
Okay. And why did you start that?
Well, actually, Freddie contacted me, so he's probably better placed because you were there before even I was.
So maybe we circle back to you coming on board as well at the same time. So I had, as context, I'd been working in fintech for some time at a company called Curve, and within the business, I'd been able to move slightly away from my strict legal practice and to do a little bit more on the business side, which was quite fun. And part of that was building out Curve's initial cryptocurrency offering. We wanted to offer Bitcoin cashback on transactions. The Curve concept, if people aren't familiar with it, it's a physical card with a digital wallet. And in your digital wallet, you can provision any number of different payment cards. And then using an app, you can switch between those. And we offered various forms of incentive and promotions. And one of those was going to be this Bitcoin cashback product, which we launched in Miami 2022. So it was quite exciting to build that. I did a lot of training at Curve around what Bitcoin was and how it differed from general crypto and so on. And as part of that, I then began to respond to parliamentary inquiries on behalf of Curve, and also in my own capacity as well, as a lawyer practicing in the field. And it became clear to me when I was going through a lot of those Treasury responses that no one was really doing this in the UK solely from a Bitcoin perspective. So I'd been interested in Bitcoin since 2013, not clever enough to buy any in 2013, but interested. Tried to mine in 2015, been running a node for a long time, and had been very interested in the space, although again, not bright enough actually to become a multimillionaire, which I will always regret. But absolutely fascinated by it and by its intersection with finance. I worked through the great financial crisis in M&A and restructuring and insolvency, so fascinated by that side of things. And then the real trigger after having done some of that initial feedback work to Treasury, to Parliament and so on, was the Edinburgh conference put on by the Bitcoin Collective in October 2022.
Did you go to that one?
No.
Oh, no. If they may rerun it at some point. It was a really lovely one. Great size, but great speakers.
It was
fantastic
really
atmosphere.
special, wasn't it?
It was. And coincidentally, Susie was there, although we hadn't met each other at that time. But after that, Jordan began to put feelers out to various people in the field.
Jordan who?
Walker.
Yes.
Oh, yes. I've met him. I've
From the
interacted
Bitcoin
with him.
Collective.
Bitcoin Collective.
Sure.
Yeah, you have met him, haven't you?
I've interacted with him on Twitter recently. But
okay.
Yeah,
he's a great guy.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim Duffy was the other organizer of the festival. And then I actually read your article about how Bitcoin can save the environment.
Yeah.
The same one, I think, that you retweeted and reached out to Susie. And together with one other person, Is she doxed or is she not?
She's would be on Company's House.
Yeah,
so
yeah. So I think it's fine. Again,
don't have to
like
name-
we were saying earlier, I'm never quite sure how.
If in doubt,
dox
we don't have to. We don't have to go there. Okay.
Yeah, and then we pulled it together as a group of volunteers with different expertise. So obviously, mine is legal, Susie, accounting and journalism, and maybe if you time for me to throw the ball over to you now.
So Freddie reached out and said, "Would you like to head up our mining subcommittee?" Because I suppose there aren't really many people that understand Bitcoin, let alone understand the mining side of it, and it was probably the most interesting part at that time, because I'd always considered myself to be an environmentalist. And, the general idea is that Bitcoin boils the oceans. But when you understand that actually it can help to mitigate greenhouse gases and all the amazing things that they're doing. And I actually learned that at the Edinburgh conference, because I wrote that article before the Edinburgh conference. And then I saw on stage the environmental panel with Obi, Margot, and Mark Morton from Skilling Mining. And they were actually talking about all the things that I had hypothetically written about. So then I went away and revised the article to show real life examples, including gridless. And I couldn't believe that all the things that I'd been learning about, I was actually watching people on stage talking about how they're actually putting it into practice. And I really felt like people needed to understand this more. So, just understanding the mining side and having that as a complete subcommittee to the policy side, because, I don't think hash rate is really appreciated as much as it should be.
Appreciated by who?
Good question. I'm going to say nation states. It's a bit of a leap at the moment, but the US currently have 40% of the hash rate, and we have something crazy like 0.1%. And at some point, that's going to become important. And we know how Bitcoin can help with grid demand response and flexible load. We know that you need to connect money back to energy. We know where this is going, and we know that the government need to start taking notice. And Freddie's written papers on nation states, and we're trying to tell them, but they're not getting it. We could reduce our energy bills. We've got the highest energy costs in
Europe, really?
Well, probably the world.
Industrial is the world.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so the costs that we're paying, like we pay £1 billion a year now on curtailment, which is to pay to switch off our wind farms, because when you build out the grid to max capacity, and say you have 10 turbines, and you might see that half of them are switched off, and that's because we don't want to overload the grid. So they pay the wind farms to switch off their operations.
And when you say they pay, it's important to notice that the people who are paying are us.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's their agreement with, essentially. A lot of are the grids privatized here?
So the grid in the UK is run by a combination of several different bodies. There's NESO, which is the National Energy Systems Operator. There's Ofgem, who are the regulator, and then the government as well. And they coordinate with National Grid to run the entire process. So there's I suppose a loose coalition of different bodies, and then of course the wind farms themselves tend to be private enterprises, which then sell the power ultimately to us, the end consumer, with the help of certain decisions that are made on our behalf, such as the fact that a curtailment cost will be added to your electricity bill at home.
So it's a private-public partnership that's essentially underwritten by the public, ensuring profits even in times of low demand, and in times of overproduction, we tell them, cut it out and we'll pay you for that so it doesn't damage the grid. When we've got a solution which is Bitcoin miners can just take up that excess load and save everybody some money. In the meantime, building up a sector that's growing importance on the international scene. So why isn't this happening? That's the question.
I think it's because there are quite a lot of jumps to make in explaining the problem. So if you start with the problem that our electricity bills are very high, we'd like to solve that. and then unpacking why they're high takes a little bit more time. And of course, none of the people who are in charge of making the decisions have very much of that time available. So part of it is there's a delicate dance of finding the right message, the right people to speak to. The interesting thing, I mean, you probably find this as well, Suze, you'd be interested to hear. I find that engineers and systems operators tends to get this much more quickly than politicians and regulators. Yes. Because the curtailment issue is just practical physics. The fact that if you're building a renewable grid, you need to overbuild because of the intermittency of supply. And it's very hard then to connect those overbuilt plants to the grid. Some of them are waiting a decade to be connected to the grid. And how on earth, in CapEx terms, if you're an engineer and you're investing in an offshore wind farm, you've got an enormous amount of day one CapEx that you're going to need to find before that farm is profitable. To the extent that there is a commercial buyer for that power, which will pay for it before there's a grid interconnection, that seems like a fairly obvious choice. But then as soon as you mention Bitcoin, people cake their pants.
So as the entrepreneur in me immediately sees the opportunity. And just as you've explained it to me, it should easily be an agreement between a private renewable energy operator and a private Bitcoin operator. So what are
not there because they're already being paid to switch off.
Oh, I see.
So why would they go and look at an alternative if they're just getting easy money?
That's the problem in a nutshell. And planning is another issue as well, because a lot of these farms will have got planning permission on the basis of electricity generation, and then having potentially to submit a planning application for change of use or mixed use if they're co-locating high performance compute on the same site or adjacent to it. Again, because so Susie's rightly pointed out that if they're getting paid to do nothing, take the easy route.
So, okay. They're being paid to switch off excess capacity, but if Bitcoin miners are there to take that capacity, why would the government still be compelled to pay them to switch it off?
They don't take Bitcoin seriously in the UK.
The government doesn't.
I don't think they don't understand it. They think you think they still think it's a joke.
Fundamentally, yes. And we can unpack why I think that is.
Maybe before we do that, just give the international audience a little bit of local context. At the moment, we have a Labour government, which I guess could be considered a centre-left party. For some people, it might be considered a little bit more to the left, but I consider them quite centre-left, especially with the leadership they have at the moment. How long ago did the Conservatives lose?
It was May last year, wasn't it?
Oh, wasn't that long ago?
No, it's about a year.
There hasn't really been a perceived change in pace towards Bitcoin. Like there hasn't been a change in attitude all that much, but perhaps you guys can add some context to that. I haven't seen anything, but you've got the experience there.
So we've gone backwards, didn't you say?
I think we've probably gone backwards.
Okay, so what's the impetus for that?
I think it's important to take a step back and think about how Bitcoin is perceived ideologically by different parties. So in the UK, the focus for Bitcoin has been very much on it as a financial instrument. And that has both good and bad consequences. So for the Conservatives, they might be inclined to like ideas like financial freedom, like autonomy, like commerce. Obviously, Margaret Thatcher very
property
famously,
rights.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. The ability to transact freely. Margaret Thatcher famously deregulated the City of London in what's known as the Big Bang in the 1980s. And that led to a huge explosion in the financial services industry in the United Kingdom. So the other aspects of Bitcoin, such as its ability to serve as a money that dictators can't shut down, its humanitarian aspects, the freedom to transact between oppressed peoples who might be being oppressed by authoritarian governments, its ability to act as a mitigator of methane emissions, or as a stabilizer for renewable grids. These are much less well-known and well-understood. And while those aspects of it might appeal to a Labour government, they have absolutely no comprehension of them at all. So you asked if there'd been a change in pace. So since we've been operating, we've corresponded with a number of the relevant ministers in the Treasury. So again, for the international audience, the Treasury fairly obviously is not dissimilar to the Treasury in the United States. And the Chancellor is the head of the Treasury, one of the most senior ministers in government. And working in the Treasury, there's a minister called the City Minister. whose full title is the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and that minister typically has responsibility for the legislation relevant to Bitcoin and to cryptocurrencies. So initially we had correspondence with Andrew Griffith, who was city minister when we started. He was actually pretty responsive. So we had good correspondence with him on debanking, on the restriction by certain banks of payments to cryptocurrency exchanges. Bim Mafalami succeeded Andrew. Bim and I were actually old friends. We'd worked together at Freshfields as lawyers before he went into politics. Again, good relationship with him. Then the change of government came. Tulip Siddiq came along. And of all of the Labour people that we corresponded with, I think Tulip actually probably had the best chance of getting her head around Bitcoin. And we had cordial correspondence with her. She wrote back at least 2 or 3 times to us in relation to questions about nation-state adoption.
All the open letters that Freddie has written and the responses are on our website as well.
Oh, yeah, if anyone wants to go back and look at the record. Thank you. And then, unfortunately, Tulip resigned, as you'll probably recall, and her replacement, Emma Reynolds, I have not had encouraging responses from. She has written back to us, but it's really the same messaging that we would have expected to see about 10 years ago. Bitcoin is it's an unbacked asset, high risk, highly volatile, and they're not taking it seriously.
So we've had a lot of progress in the United States from the top. Has that had any effect at all? Is that helping to break through, at least perhaps in some unofficial way, with the government here?
It's interesting you say that this week, because Scott Bessent has just met with Rachel Reeves, and actually, as context, some new legislation was published this week. I've written a short explainer for it to publish that on Twitter, and I've added to that thread the actual text of Reeves' speech today. She did meet with Scott Bessent, and I think it's really interesting you point that out, because the UK is going to end up playing catch up here behind the US. What do you think, Susie?
I don't think we'll ever catch up.
No, no, not now.
No, I think that we can do our best to try and mend some of the damage that has been caused by them not understanding. Because, like you say all the time, we were the centre of financial services, and we have a really amazing history in computer science. Those two things together, we should be all over this.
Yeah, it kind of baffles me that since the global financial crisis, 2008, and then eventually the vote with Brexit, has encouraged a lot of banks to then offshore their City and Canary Wharf operations, that with the pedigree of this city, let alone the country, as being a financial trade capital of the world, that they haven't recognised Bitcoin as being an opportunity in line with the country's history.
Yeah.
And they haven't really grasped the idea and the opportunity as yet. And to have this sort of backward view, as you mentioned, repeating many of the talking points from 10 years ago as if nothing's changed in that time. There's been no academic studies. There's been no practical examples like the Texas grid example.
It's not hypothetical, they're actually doing it.
It's actually happening.
Yeah.
And it's not ideologues who are then going off championing the results. It's the grid operator themselves saying, this has been fantastic for us.
You can hate Bitcoin and still benefit from it.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So, funny.
So I was going to ask. Okay, so we've got 2 points of pressure. We've got the Trump administration essentially with Rachel Reeves saying, "Okay, we're going to synchronize our regulatory framework." Maybe that's too strong a word, but we're going to much closer align our regulatory frameworks for cryptocurrencies, right? And perhaps they may only mean CBDCs or stablecoin legislation, maybe not anything related to Bitcoin at all. And then you've got, I guess, the broader political establishment that's kind of, at best, indifferent to Bitcoin, and at worst, still repeating the same criticisms from 10 years ago. So how do we reconcile these two pressures? What do you think is the path forward from there?
I don't have an answer, really. It's just...
I had some thought. You fire away, and I wanted to pick up on something you meant. You go first.
I just think that you have to keep providing good education. I don't think there's any easy answer to this. That's why Freddie, his papers are so important. That's why we have to exist. Because if we don't, they'll be getting their information from the likes of Crypto UK. And I'm not convinced that they understand Bitcoin. You just have to look at their consultation papers to see that they perhaps don't. And so one really soul-crushing thing is like, I'm going to the Financial Times Digital Asset Summit next week to speak. There's no Bitcoin representation on those panels. Bitcoin has a 64% dominance, and even the Financial Times Digital Asset Summit can't get on board and give it the time that it deserves.
So why is that happening? Is it because it's much easier to excite traditional finance with the grift of crypto, the opportunities within?
When you say grift, this is exactly it. I mean, when you go to these things and you listen to people, there's no substance. There's so many, because it is like the Wild West. Crypto is completely. They don't have the knowledge required to actually talk about it in any detail. And even when you speak to a lot of these people, they don't even understand the difference between Bitcoin and crypto. They don't understand that Bitcoin is the innovation, and it's a decentralized protocol, and that crypto are VC-backed companies. Like, they couldn't explain it to you in any simple terms.
I think partly it's for the flipping that on its head. It's exactly what you've said, but from the other end of the telescope. So a company like Ripple, to someone who works in the city, has an aura of respectability because they're a big company. They function in a way that someone in the city understands. They have a board of directors. They have shareholders. They are respectable men in suits. Bitcoin is an unruly asset, and sometimes we forget how unruly it is. And if you're sitting in Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, you look at this thing which has no board of directors, no shareholders, no governance structure.
How many times have you been asked who the CEO of Bitcoin is? I get asked it all the time from people.
It's Brad Garlinghouse, isn't it? So to someone who works, and this is the world I live in, this world I come from, to someone who works in that context, Bitcoin looks terrifying. It also looks insane. But, that's one of the reasons we like it.
What's your answer to that? Because I would say, who's the CEO of oil? Who was the CEO of gold? Who was the CEO of fresh water?
I think that's completely right. My answer to that has typically been Bitcoin is akin to TCP/IP, which underlies the internet, or the secure mail transfer protocol. It is a piece of code that anyone can contribute to and which functions without oversight, without governance via board of directors or shareholders. So, like Susie rightly said, explaining that everything else is a venture-backed tech company, and I worked in tech for years. I'm totally cool with venture-backed companies. Don't try and pretend that your Web3 coin is anything other than a token issued by your company. Bitcoin is, as you say, it's more akin to oil or to gold and I tend to describe it as a digital commodity money that's not issued by a nation state. And again, actually sort of circling back to something you mentioned earlier around why the political establishment really struggles to understand it. Last night I was with a bunch of my economist friends. I studied at Cambridge. I did classics. A lot of them did economics. They went off to work in the city. So did I. I'm known as the Bitcoin guy, and then I try not to talk about it because I get the same reaction. Someone asks about Bitcoin 2025, and then someone said, "Oh, he's talking about Bitcoin again," and then four of them exaggeratedly turn their backs for a joke. Fair enough. No one who wants to listen to me talk about Bitcoin.
I do.
But it's really interesting that I think for those kind of people, I think this is true of the UK generally, there hasn't really been any selection pressure in evolutionary terms for people to need to adopt Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting when you look outside the United Kingdom to other countries where where the need for Bitcoin is obvious. I think if you've worked in the city and, some of these guys, they'll be on $1 million a year, the existing system has worked very well for them. So where is the pressure coming from for them to even try to understand this? if they don't think they need it, and practically speaking, I think they're right. They don't need it. It's probably not for them. We're getting to the point where their institutions may be figuring out they can make money from it. And so that's a selection pressure towards adoption by financial institutions, which we're obviously beginning to see in the US, and I suspect we'll begin to see in the United Kingdom. But it's rather like a 2% inflation rate. So 2% I find a really interesting number because it's just high enough for you to continue being debased, but it's not quite so high that you go into the streets with torches and pitchforks. Like at 2%, you'll lose half of your purchasing power over 35 years. At 10%, you lose half your purchasing power in 7 years. You notice that a lot more. But I think the UK is kind of a victim of our relative stability in terms of our inability to understand Bitcoin.
I think the problem statement is a really important one to shape. And you're right, a lot of these people who are, rather successful within the system don't really see that. Whereas the average person, if you talk to them about the cost of living, you just have to say, do you think the cost of living has gone up? Everyone, hell yeah. Why do you think that is? Do they know about monetary debasement fueling inflation?
They know something's wrong. They just don't know what it is. But going back to them not understand, or a lot of the space, people not understanding the difference between Bitcoin and crypto, I'll give you a really good example of this. So going back to the Financial Times Digital Asset Summit, they wanted to put me on a staking panel. And I wrote back to them.
I'm sorry, I have to laugh.
I wrote back to them saying I might not be the best person for this because Bitcoin is proof of work. The response was, you'll just bring a different angle to it. Okay, all right.
They don't really understand the principal difference and why you might object to that, right?
I didn't object. It would be a good opportunity for me to sit on a staking panel and tell them why I don't think staking's good. So I then had the pre-panel conversation with them.
So tell us about that. What did they do in the pre-panel? Because this is really important. A lot of people don't quite understand when they see an interview on television, when they see perhaps a mainstream media organization have a panel like this. What do they do in the pre-panel?
So we had a little meeting to discuss the direction that they wanted to take it in. Unfortunately, the moderator didn't turn up, but there was just me and this other guy from, probably shouldn't say who he was, and he was very much pro-staking. And I was, my argument was, I don't think staking is going to be any good for institutions because Bitcoin has a 64% dominance, everything's bleeding into Bitcoin, and it's proof of work. So just by that alone, it suggests that maybe staking won't be a great thing for institutions. And we were talking about how the FCA didn't understand the difference between Bitcoin and crypto, etc. And as the discussion went on, the other chat was getting, he basically said, I know what's going on. This is some kind of Bitcoin philosophical kind of, like, he was trying to play it down as if I was, not that I understood the difference, but it was more of a kind of, philosophy or an ideology rather than a fact. And so towards the end, they suddenly shut the call off very quickly when the penny dropped. And she said, I want this to be about education. I don't want this to be about debate. And I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable on the panel. And then she just very quickly ended the call.
Oh, wow.
And
what do you think was motivating that?
I think she didn't understand the industry, how Bitcoin fits into the industry, and why maybe I was the least ideal person for that panel out of all the panels that they could have put me on. So then obviously a couple of days later, I get an email saying, you're not right for that panel. Now, I did try and tell you that. We'll like to put you on a compliance panel instead. And I thought, that's fine. I can do that. That is definitely more suitable. But when you look at if you look at the agenda and you look at the speakers, there's no Bitcoin representation there. And honestly, it's painful. So even to the point that they put me on a staking panel, how on earth can you understand so little about it that you would put someone who's Bitcoin only on something like that?
So I guess my question is, what's driving that? Is it just a persistent ignorance and distance from the industry, or is it an aversion to Bitcoin?
I think it's probably a combination of money and ignorance.
Yeah.
It's very easy, and actually it's easy for me to be dismissive of that now. But I remember how little. I mean, I mentioned earlier, I started reading about Bitcoin in 2013. Had absolutely no idea how it worked. First came across it during the Cypriot banking crisis. Took me years and years to understand how the 21 million cap couldn't be increased. How can't you control it? It was a really long time before I realized that simply owning a lot of Bitcoin didn't necessarily mean that you could control the protocol. And,
No,
but
my concentration of wealth is a bad thing, though.
Concentration of wealth is a bad thing, but I think the point is that unlike owning all of the shares in a company or having weighted voting rights, that doesn't give you control over the protocol.
No.
And a lot of these people will have been parachuted into a new job, like 1 or 2 years. They'll have been a lot of Web3 money will have been thrown at them, and they will have not a iota of understanding about proof of work and proof of stake, and about decision making in different protocols, and about how fundamentally important those things are. I mean, and again, trying to peel these things back when I'm talking to someone who may be interested but has no knowledge, I come back to the fact that Bitcoin is a sequence of transactions. Miners compete to determine that sequence of transactions, and they compete in a particular way and for a particular reason. And the question you've got to ask is, what is the cost to the people who write those transactions down in that order? And then understanding that there is a cost both in electricity and power then opens a door down so you can begin to understand why proof of work is so important.
So, we've just, I think we've well and truly recovered from the last bear market and the trauma of all the bankruptcies and everything else that was in the broader cryptocurrency space that I think dragged Bitcoin down way below what I think it should have, what should have been the low in the last bear market. But I being kind of newish in the space, in 2021, I started this account, and it always occurred, how are these people getting sucked into yield that they don't know how it's generated?
Yeah.
And I think for most people, they truly don't have an appreciation of what is underlying the promise of the yield. We're so accustomed to living in a digital world and now managing our money in a digital format that when we see a number that's a promise of a yield, we don't really associate any of the kinds of risks, because the user interface for pressing click and send and stake and whatever is exactly the same as if you're putting money into an ISA or, a bank deposit for an interest. And because the user experience is essentially the same, you're just clicking boxes on screens and sending money in that way and locking things up, that people don't perceive that there's a fundamental risk of catastrophic loss for your money. And so I think we've got a huge challenge, because I don't think that behavior has gone away. I don't think we've discouraged that as a result of what happened in the last bear market. But
how will you when there's so much money there?
I'm not sure that we will be able to, in time, to avert Wall Street turbocharging the BlockFi and Celsius playbook in the next 5 years. I don't think we can avert that, because their marketing power is so hard to counter. There's two parts to that. I think they're going to drive onboarding at a mass scale, and they're going to drive up enormous risks through the reintroduction of yield and staking into the cryptocurrency ecosystem, which will drag in Bitcoin too, because a lot of the people who are being onboarded through their marketing efforts have no working memory of what happened in 2022. So I think that risk is real, and I'm not sure that anything can be done about it, except for people will have to live and learn the hard way again.
Maybe that's not a bad thing as well.
It is a bad thing, but it's not inevitable. It's not avoidable, in my opinion. I think it's a bad thing that people are going to get wrecked.
Yeah.
Because lives will be destroyed. And it just reminds me of that scene. We're going to be all right.
Dance.
But don't fucking dance. Yeah. And it's just, what a great scene that was. And I felt that, I lived through that. I watched the chart in 2000 7 and 8. Was it 8 that it started, or it's late 7 it started?
2007
And it's
began.
just-
We saw it coming that summer.
Every 6 or 8 weeks, another leg down. And you think, is it over yet? And then another leg down. And I remember, I'm like, gosh, this is just the markets. Wait until it hits the economy. And I don't think, for example, London has ever recovered from that.
I don't think. In fact, I think there's a strong argument to make that the world hasn't recovered from the financial crisis. I have a pet theory that the risks and the damage were simply transferred from private balance sheets to public ones, and those problems are still there. Actually, while you were talking, you made a lot of really interesting points there, and I couldn't scribble them down quickly enough.
Oh, that's all right.
If I may, you were saying something quite interesting about how I like this theory where banks and financial institutions are going to seize on this new piece of fresh meat and effectively refinancialize all of the yield crap that we've seen.
Can I expand on that? My justification for it.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I mean, my observations of what Wall Street does is when they see something bad, they don't think, oh, we should stay away from that. They look at that and go, how can we do that, but at scale?
Yes.
And we saw that, we saw it from long-term capital management to who did it go to after the long-term capital management? What was the big one after that? Enron.
Yeah.
And then from Enron to Wall Street. What Wall Street did after Enron was go, oh, who are the guys engineering all that stuff? Why don't you come over to our shop and show us how you did that? WorldCom was another one, yeah. And then eventually the 2008 financial crisis, which was essentially an industry-wide, economy-wide, and a global phenomenon that just increased in scale. From LTCM was just a one shop, really. And then it just got larger and larger in scale. So I think the same thing is going to happen. I think Wall Street saw what BlockFi did and probably thought, that's interesting. And they will sell it on the basis of we have better risk management and controls. They have the relationships with the regulators to be able to get a green tick on any kind of product that they want to push out there. We know that. And ratings agencies are bought and paid for already. So we know they're going to give the green tick as well. And so there's nothing standing in the way of Wall Street launching all of these products at scale. Like they're going to supercharge everything, and that's really scary prospects. Sorry, Freddie, you were going to add to that.
No, that was super interesting to hear you unpack that. One additional factor to that puzzle is obviously in the UK we have the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, and they have similar compensation schemes in the United States. In the UK, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme means that you are protected as a retail investor from financial losses for I think it's $85,000 per institution, and it's not dissimilar in the United States. American Hodl is keen on pointing out that we live in a nerfed world where you're effectively protected from the consequences of your actions. We as Bitcoiners know that if we fuck up, there is no protection. There is no financial services compensation scheme coming for us. But the products you've just described, they are going to be backed by the same type of financial services compensation schemes that already exist for non-crypto assets. And the huge disadvantage with those is who picks up the tab for that compensation. It's the government, and that's ultimately us, and it's ultimately reflected in a continuing debasement of the purchasing power of your currency. Because like we said earlier, those risks are taken off your personal balance sheet. You'll get your $85,000 back. You may need to wait a bit of time, but there's no moral hazard any longer. So you're effectively investing in a risk-free environment, which in my perspective is not how investing should. You should be rewarded for taking risk, and you should be punished if you take a risk and you fuck up. That's how we learn. That's how evolution functions. It's how we progress as a species.
Absolutely. We touched on moral hazard in 2 of my interviews so far. I asked Max and Stacey, and also James Lavish and Preston Pish as well, that we need moral hazard. And one of the beauties of what happened, I want to be careful with this. One of the things that I think in the long term is a very healthy thing for the ecosystem, rather than the beauty of what happened in the bear market, is that people understood that you've got to eat your own cooking. If you're careless, if you're reckless, there are no bailouts in Bitcoin. And I love that there are no bailouts in Bitcoin because it promotes proper risk management and risk assessment.
Exactly.
Only if you've got the right information, though. That does bother me.
Expand on that.
Well, you said here, marketing. I can't even read I wrote it down because it was brilliant. I can't even read my own handwriting. Marketing power, large to counter.
Yeah, I think the power of Wall Street, the marketing machine. This
is the thing. Like when it comes to the information that people receive, it's all through marketing campaigns and then articles. I mean, I read one that said, go with Cardano because Bitcoin is just a boomer coin. So with all these pump and dump schemes, what they do is we know they issue their tokens, they convince people, get retail to come in, and then they come out. So you might think that you're doing your research and you might think that you understand exactly what it is. You might think that you've got some information that somebody else hasn't read and that you're ahead of it. Who's to say they're not? Like, that's why we exist, because there is no good Bitcoin education. So we are expecting people to do their research, but when the research is through these marketing companies that are backed by the likes of Ripple and Circle and all of those companies from hell, how do we expect people to sieve through all that and make good choices?
You're right. I honestly prefer meme coins to Web3 companies.
Yeah.
At least they're pure garbage.
They're honest. Yeah.
And there is zero pretension that a meme coin is anything but a gamble.
Yeah.
I have no sort of, if something's pretending to be the next Bitcoin, I've got a huge problem with that. If someone's going fart coin, shit coin, or whatever it is, and it's just a meme, I'm like, mate, if you want to gamble on the momentum of that, go for it. Because you can't pretend that's going to be the next Bitcoin. You can't pretend it has decentralized properties or any such garbage. Yeah, all right. And so it's pure unadulterated gambling. And if you want to gamble, if you want to bet on the horses, on the football or whatever, do it. But don't present it as like a surefire win or anything like that. Like I have friends who gamble. I don't care. I have friends who gamble on meme coins. I don't care, right? But they don't try to sell it to me just like...
They don't tell you it's the next Bitcoin and that you should come out of Bitcoin and go into that.
No, of course. Yeah, if they did that, I'd have a huge problem with that because it's bullshit, right?
Yeah.
So...
but this is another problem that we've got with marketing powers too large to counter. So we're a volunteer organisation. All the organisations around us that we think don't give the correct information are so well funded by these Web3 companies, and that's what we're up against. So we've got a team of 14, and they're all incredible, and everybody puts their time and effort into it because they believe in what they're doing. You don't find many companies where people operate like that they do it because they believe in the cause. When you're trying to counter a lot of the information of these hugely well-funded companies, events like the FT Digital Asset Summit, how can you? You're a little organisation of 14 unpaid, 14 volunteers up against all these other huge forces that have insane amounts of money behind them. How do you deal with that?
Putting some numbers on that, I mean, our first filed accounts are public. The first year we managed to run on, I think, about £1,500, £1,500 for the first year of work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all on a shoestring. So £1,500 like running costs, and everyone's working for free because we've got to fill a gap, because we understand. If you read Freddie's papers, they're so beautifully written.
Thank you.
They
So
are.
are your articles.
You don't get that.
And so are your tweets.
Yes, love your tweets.
Masterpiece, yeah.
You don't get that quality from these. A lot of people have said that what we're doing, the quality of it is far superior to any of these organisations. But we just don't have the financial backing that they do. So how do you solve that? Because there is no CEO of Bitcoin.
Yeah. I love to dream up ideas and strategies, and I feel rather defeatist about this particular issue. I think it's unavoidable. The power of Wall Street, the marketing machine, and the relationship with all the interested parties like media and regulators is pretty much You can't. I don't think you can mess with that unless you have the ear of someone really high up in the administration, which apparently they seem kind of receptive, but I think they're more about stepping on the gas full throttle and letting it rip and see where this thing goes, rather than any kind of measured way of pushing forward with some kind of regulatory framework that protects people. And I think that's been the way most administrations have worked. You know, America has been a nation of booms and busts for the longest time. And I guess it's within the spirit and culture of that nation that, you know, and perhaps some Americans in the comments will correct us, but I've always perceived it as that way, as like when there's an opportunity, they just go all out. And if there's overinvestment or a incorrect assessment of risk, so be it, you know.
I respect that about the American
in many
culture.
ways, I do too. Yeah, I do too. Yeah, they're really enterprising and free spirited in that way.
Yeah.
You know, for all the things that one may criticize them about, they've definitely got something very admirable there, and I love that about them. I just wonder, is there some kind of way to mitigate some of the risks that we're talking about? Because it does feel like it's an inevitable wave of destruction that's going to hit in the next. I don't know when that's going to ramp up, but I think it will be probably in the next 12 or 18 months that it will really ramp up. So I'm not of the view that we're going to get a deep bear market like we just experienced. If we do, we might get, you know, a 6 month correction or some more continued chop. But I do think that there will eventually be a huge effort on the part of Wall Street to push a lot of these same products that wreaked havoc on everybody's wealth in the ecosystem. And look, Wall Street, in the last cycle, it was these influencers, key opinion leaders, or Coles, as they called them, that were sort of the trusted brands who were pushing a lot of this garbage. But that pales into significance with the scale at which a JP Morgan, a Morgan Stanley, Citibank, or a Goldman Sachs is trusted by the greater population. And when they step on the marketing gas and start spending and pushing that through mainstream media, a lot of people are going to trust that in...
That's why people don't like Bitcoin, because they've been listening to the mainstream media.
Sure, yeah. Well, they're going to love Bitcoin, and then they're going to be convinced to
get fake
stake
Bitcoin
it for a yield.
Yeah,
that's really concerning.
Yeah,
and then they'll suffer losses. Those losses will be covered by some form of compensation scheme, and those losses will be moved onto government balance sheets, reinforcing the need for a hard-capped money that the government can't inflate. So, I mean, I'm not going to go and say everything is good for Bitcoin, but ultimately, unpleasant and painful mistakes can lead you to understand. And, you know, FTX is a good example. FTX was unregulated offshore because of poor regulation in the United States. If that had been onshore, those risks might not have been as significant. But at the same time, as we said before, being exposed to an element of risk is healthy. And learning how to mitigate and avoid loss is also healthy. And living in a nerfed world where nothing ever bad is going to happen to you is no way to progress as a human being.
That's why I'm opposed to capital gains tax on things like that, because if you've done your research and you've taken the risk, why should they take a percentage of that? You've taken that risk and you've worked it all out, so surely you should have the profits.
So the question I would ask is, if Bitcoin is property, why should it be treated any differently from a tax perspective than any other property?
Because it's also money, and so like they have in the Czech Republic, it should be treated as money, and you don't.
We don't have that classification here.
So the context. Oh, how geeky do you want to get?
Let's go. Yeah, get into it. Let's get into it.
So yeah, the Czech example before we move away from that is interesting. So that they have a holding period. So if you hold Bitcoin for, I think it's 3 years in the Czech Republic, then it's capital.
Germany has something similar with 12 months, and I think Portugal also.
Yes.
Yep.
So effectively, there's no capital gains charge if you've held the asset for that period of time. So on property and what Bitcoin is, this is something where we've actually seen some decent movement in the UK. So probably since 2023, we've been pushing Treasury to recognize Bitcoin as real and as property. I think getting them to recognize it as money is a bit of ways down the road. So we were very supportive of the Law Commission's report, which is very long, but I recommend if you've got a few hours spare, give it a read. Those guys sat down and they really tried to understand the market. They tried to understand Bitcoin and crypto and how the systems work. Really good piece of work, and I'm not bigging them up just because I'm also a lawyer. So in the UK, under English law recognises traditionally two different types of property. One is called, it's a French word, a chose in possession, and that's a thing, a can, a pen. And the other is called a chose in action, and those are things which give you rights. So, for example, a contractual right, a right to be repaid a debt. If I make a loan to you, then the loan is property which I own, and it's a liability for you. So the Law Commission advised, and we supported them in this, that Bitcoin and crypto don't really fit neatly into either of those two buckets because they're not physical, and certainly in the case of Bitcoin, it doesn't really give any rights either. It's almost property that you can hold in your mind. So it's not quite like a contract. It's not quite like a physical thing either. And there's a piece of legislation currently going through Parliament which states that something shall not be, and I think this is a rather clever way of doing it, something shall not be property, shall not be excluded from being property solely because it doesn't fit into one of the two existing categories. And English law drafting is traditionally very, very good at this kind of stuff. So they have fenced out a very large piece of white space and says anything in that piece of white space shan't be stopped from being property because it's not in the black space.
One of the
outside.
two.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And hopefully that will go through. That's been proposed by the House of Lords. It's currently going through second or third reading, I believe. And once that is law, then I think that's a really good step towards people taking this seriously. Because as we've been saying throughout this conversation, the attitude in the UK is that if we close our eyes hard enough, eventually this stuff will all just disappear.
Yeah. Unfortunately, my mind keeps drifting to the things that we can't do in the United Kingdom with respect to Bitcoin. And banks are foremost of this sort of the negativity because
the on-off ramps and how
they're
hard it is.
They're really trying hard to stop you.
You spent 45 minutes on the phone trying to convince someone that it's okay for you to send the money to an exchange.
Yeah. I mean, to give some more context to that, a few months ago, I tried to send money to an exchange to buy some Bitcoin. And I had to break that up into 2 transactions because it was too much for them. I mean, it wasn't. It was too much for them. Yeah. Okay. Context needed. And believe me, it wasn't that much. It was just too much for them. So I had to break that up into 2 payments. Both times, they put me through their script. I had to call them. They put me through a script. That script generates a conversation of about 20 to 25 minutes. The first time I did that kind of quite obediently, okay, let's just get this over and done with. The very next day, they ran the exact same script on me, and it was all ostensibly to make sure that I wasn't getting scammed, even though if they really wanted to do that, they could just say, we've read the script to this guy at least for 30 days. We don't have to bother him with risk management.
Very good.
But their actual objective seems to be to frustrate the living hell out of you to the point where you either don't transact to an exchange. So I wonder if they're really worried about losing funds.
Or is it incompetence?
I don't think it's incompetence. I don't think it is.
I've got a suggestion. After you.
Yeah, the reason why I don't think it's incompetence is banks are very sensitive about how they use their resources with respect to customer services. They measure things to the nth degree. I've sat in a call center. I've seen some of their dashboards and the way they manage things every single call. Like if you're sitting in one of those call center desks and you're just a little bit slower than the average, someone will come and say, is everything all right? Is there something we can do to help you?
To the workers?
Yes, yeah. Can we support you? Is
it a bit more sinister than that, though?
You mean the way they can? Yes, of course it is. Yeah. Of course it is.
You sounded so lovely when you said it.
Yeah. Believe me, when they come over to you and they say, is everything all right? Yeah. It's a very sort of dystopian.
Yeah.
Banks don't employers in general, when they ask you that in a big company, there's a reason why. Anyway, there's a reason why they're asking how you are. No, it's not because they care about how you are. It's about your performance falling below the average. And they measure that to the nth degree. And that was more than 20 years ago when I was, when I saw that stuff in action. And so I can only imagine now with better analytics, faster data feeds and everything. It must be
brutal, yeah.
Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible job. So I don't think that they would be wasting resources like that just through incompetence, because I think their systems in deploying those teams are far too good to waste that. I think it's a deliberate ploy to frustrate certain customers, either to stem the outflow of funds or to frustrate the customers such that they leave, because they really don't want anyone who's dabbling in Bitcoin or crypto or anything like that. They really don't. Like they want you to leave regardless of your banking history, your client history, how much money you've had with them, what kind of loans you've taken.
So it's a concern that it's leaving the current financial system. So if you are going and you're gambling, you can lose your money because it's still staying within the system. So they don't actually care. So it's got nothing to do about risk or protecting you. It's just the exodus from the current system. That's what you think they're scared of.
Possibly. Or possibly they've just made a decision that they don't want these types of customers. So that was my experience with them.
Except it's your money, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was the most frustrating thing. So on the second day that I had to endure this call, instead of it being like a 15, 20-minute conversation, my frustrations led it to being a 45-minute.
Did you lecture them on Bitcoin?
And was it the same script?
Yes, exactly the same.
For God's sake.
Yeah, exactly the same.
I mean, I'm not surprised you got annoyed.
And I was so angry and so worked up, and I got disappointed in myself because I let myself get worked up over it, which I'm usually pretty good at pulling myself off the edge. But on this day, I'm just like, they really are trying to. Okay, I see what's happening here. And so, sorry, that was. I just wanted to give that context about the banks, and what we were talking about now is sort of.
It wasn't the same person you had, was
No,
it? Because that would have been.
I doubt it.
Even for that person, it would have been awful.
Yeah. I mean,
because they have to do it.
You've got to feel a bit sorry for them as well.
Yeah, I do.
Having to do this to dozens of people.
That's the dual frustration, is the realization that actually that person's got nothing to do with the decision to read this script and frustrate
they're being recorded.
And they're being recorded. And it's very robotic and non-engaging, which adds to the frustration, of course. At the least I can say, I was rude to the extent that I raised my voice at them, but I didn't say anything sort of untoward.
But you still think it's incompetence?
No, actually, I mean, there's an additional point it's useful to make, which is not completely obvious. And much as I hate to be fair to banks, I think it's important to point this out. So some of it, in addition to I think that there's some ideological opposition to Bitcoin. I think the fear about money leaving the system is a correct one. And we know that certain people at different banks are ideologically opposed to Bitcoin. So the head of Starling Bank, for example, has taken a policy decision not to allow Starling to be used for cryptocurrency payments. Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan has done the same. So Chase Bank customers in the UK can no longer make those payments. And that's a policy decision from the banks. And that's ideologically driven, I think. There's an additional one, which is their own financial self-interest. So there's a type of fraud which is called authorized push payment fraud. And the way to understand that is if I make a legitimate payment and I'm intending to make that payment, but it's to a fraudulent person, a fraudulent payee, recipient of that money, that's called authorized push payment because I've authorized the payment and it's gone through, but I haven't got the product or service that I wanted. Now, again, well-meaning regulation has led to unfortunate consequences. Until recently, banks could be on the hook for, I think, over 400k per instance of APP fraud. So when you combine that with the fact that there obviously were a lot of scams in the crypto industry, and the banks are incapable of distinguishing between you transferring to Strike, let's say, and to some Web3 nonsense, one of which has a much lower risk profile. And actually, sorry, we should talk about risk profiles as well. We love risk. Banks took the not stupid decision to say that, we're exposed to so much APP fraud risk here. Each instance is a colossal amount of money. We're just going to say no, or we're going to restrict you to minimize the amount of our risk exposure. So there is an element of wanting to avoid themselves being on the hook if a transaction happens to be fraudulent, and it's easier for them from a compliance and risk management perspective to say, right, mate, you can only transfer 5K a month or something like that.
But there's an intelligent way of doing that. For example, the exchange I was sending money to, I've used a number of times. Yes. I'm sending it to the same account. It's been approved. I've got it in my list of payees, right? So like if I was being defrauded and it was an APP fraud.
They should give you a 30-day grace at least.
Yeah, doing it twice. I'm
not doing it like more than a dozen times over a few years. Like that's just that's ridiculous, right? So that's why I think I don't think it's good intentions with unintended consequences. I think it's probably malicious in the sense that they want to push you away.
Could it be both?
And perhaps. But the other thing is the limits are really restrictive. We're talking 10K a month.
Monzo's just dropped theirs to 5. It was in the news yesterday.
So I've got the issue of if I ever need to sell.
Yeah. Like what if you wanted to buy your house?
Oh, no. God forbid. God forbid. If you need to sell to upgrade your life, just do it. Just do it. Okay, if that's what's going to improve your life here and now,
I agree.
Do it, right? Like you've got to live your life too. That's all, right? I mean, it's all very well being ideological about this stuff.
What if you wanted to sell your house because you know that Bitcoin is a better property, or you wanted to just not have the tie of that, and you wanted to put all of your house proceeds into Bitcoin? You can't do that.
That would be very difficult. Then again, it would be very difficult to do very much with that amount of money because generally moving large amounts of money at Aussie.
Yeah, it's the show mascot. Sorry to be a distraction, but he's distracting me, so here he is. All right, we can keep talking if we can.
Does he ever talk on the podcast?
Never. If he gets bored, he might let out a bark, and that's about it, though.
Okay.
All right.
But it's important to consider that just doing stuff with your fiat is surprisingly difficult. Yeah. If you went to the bank and tried to withdraw your life savings, you would have real difficulty in doing that.
Yep.
There's an Aussie who does a hilarious clip on YouTube of trying to take 10 grand out of his bank account, and
at the teller, he goes into the teller. Yeah, and it's my money. You can't do it.
Yeah, I want to, but I need it for steroids. The summer's coming up. I want to get a pump on. What do you need the money for? He says, he's this big butch guy. He says, I'm going to have gender reassignment surgery. I need this to pay for my bottom surgery.
But I like the way he's inserted some social justice causes. And,
I went to the bank and tried to take. It was only about £3,000. I can't even remember what it was actually for.
Yeah.
It wasn't a large amount, and I had to go through all the quizzes, etc. And I said that it was because I was doing some research on central bank digital currencies. Used it as to see how society has become cashless, to see if I can survive for the next 3 months without using a card, and just took it as an opportunity to lecture the cashier.
Well, if I didn't use my card, I would not be able to buy a coffee at any of the local coffee shops. They don't take them. It's too much of a hassle for them. Our local leisure centre
is completely cashless.
Yeah.
So many places are.
Yeah. And I guess with the increasing levels of desperation in society, it's, robbery is a real risk at these places that handle cash now. And we don't think about that too much. No. So like I have some family friends who have retail businesses that are reasonably successful, back home, and they've been robbed a couple of times.
Really, yeah.
In really quite
in Melbourne.
In violent ways, right?
Right.
That's awful.
Because you can see when a retail business is successful, and if you see that they handle cash, the cash is there and it has to leave somehow at one point, and so they stake it out. All right. They stake it out quite patiently, and it's not hard to understand the rhythms of a retail business, especially a coffee shop where it's quite normal to sit there for an hour or two. And you do that over the course of weeks, and suddenly you understand who's senior, who's junior, who moves when and how. I don't want to break it down
I
any
hadn't
further
considered
than that.
Yeah, no. So basically, the rise of social unrest is leading to more criminality, which then puts them more at risk. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think I want to get back to how restricted the banks are. So if you had to sell for any kind of reason, and suddenly had a change of circumstances, or perhaps you just thought, Bitcoin's gone parabolic. I want to de-risk some of that and take some money off the table, and maybe look after my family with this or that. And then you had a change of heart for whatever reason, or you liked the lower prices and wanted to reinvest. You can't take that money back into Bitcoin very easily. At HSBC, it would take you, let's say you sold $100,000 worth. It would take you 10 months to put that money back into Bitcoin.
Good point.
10 months, because they won't allow anything more than 10,000 a month. And there might even be a transaction limit as well.
Quite possibly.
So, that's just absolutely ridiculous. That's what I was told. So I was told that was a bank-wide policy without exceptions.
I mean, one workaround for this is making sure that you have multiple bank accounts so that, sadly, it's not a problem I have, but if you needed to move that amount of money, then taking the annoying step of setting up multiple bank accounts and making sure that they're all used and all of your transactions are within, hang on, we're getting dangerously close to sort of money laundering advice here. So,
well, it's not money laundering, though,
it's
right?
your own
because
money
laundering is with the specific intention of avoiding paying tax or obfuscating its source of income.
Crime, right?
You shouldn't
and
have
so that's
to do that.
That's a very different thing from I just want to move my money.
My own money,
which has been I've paid tax on, and the source of it has been verified. There's nothing dirty about that at all. So it's not money laundering, but there are also issues about structuring that could get you into trouble as well. Like if you structure transactions, even if there is no clear intent to commit a crime,
you'll get flagged by someone will make a suspicious activity report.
Exactly. So
actually, it occurred to me while you were speaking there, one potentially helpful effect of some of the increasing regulation we're seeing is that I've felt for a long time, and we're beginning to see this in the legislation, that exchanges are going to become more and more bank-like over time. And to the extent that you are then dealing with two regulated entities, the risk departments in each of those banks and bank and exchange, as they begin to converge, may begin to take a more enlightened view to you moving that money. So I suspect you'll still have the restrictions around moving large amounts of cash or your suspicious activity reports and so on.
It's really interesting you're saying that banks and these exchanges will eventually converge, because my mind jumps to analogs between traditional finance and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency ecosystems, and like this country has two major national champions that are on the sort of global banking scene with Barclays and HSBC, and there have been many others over time, but we don't seem to have at scale yet any kind of national champion. I know we have Coin, and not to disparage them, but like I'm thinking more at the scale of what is the rival to Coinbase and Binance in the United Kingdom that is
They
native.
can't really operate here, though.
But why is it that Coinbase can operate here?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Right, you mean like a UK equivalent of them?
That's
okay.
right, yeah.
So some of that's historic and some of it is down to present regulation. So from a historic perspective, the UK is obviously one of the, I suppose, the original nation states where banking really became the global business as it is today. Important to note for truth purposes that modern banking, as we currently know it, originally emerged in Italy, so fair play to the Italians. But it became so massive in the United Kingdom, not least because of, frankly, the imperial ambitions of the United Kingdom and companies such as the Dutch East India Company and the central bank in the United Kingdom was obviously created originally to fund wars and then hung around like a bad smell for several centuries afterwards. So it's important to consider, I think, the historical reasons for why the banking industry has been so powerful in the United Kingdom. And then obviously that was reflected in the United States. And given that banking and imperium are so closely entwined with each other, it makes complete sense that the United States is now the financial hub of the entire planet. And that's also, I think, in conjunction with the strong tech industry in the United States, is probably why you see the convergence and emergence of companies like Coinbase, which got started very early. Coin Corner, in fairness, has been around a very long time. 2014, I think they started. And they acquired CoinFloor, I believe, from Obi Nwosu was founder of CoinFloor, wasn't he? Mm. So we've got good history in the United Kingdom, but I think the reason they haven't grown as much as in the United States is because of the chilling effect of regulation over here. The debanking problems that we were talking about a few minutes ago, those apply equally to exchanges. And although Choke Point 2, for any listeners who aren't familiar, that was the slightly covert attempt to debank and undermine the cryptocurrency industry in the United States by denying them access to financial services that you need to operate a commercial business. That has happened to an extent here as well. I believe Danny at Coin Corner is quite open about his own personal experience of being debanked as the founder of that kind of business, and the difficulty that the business itself faces in getting access to finance. People need to get paid. You have to pay salaries and pay rent and so on. And so this, I think, it's simply a reflection of the fact that poor regulation does have a chilling effect on people's ability to operate what are legitimate, honest, and good businesses.
That's a shame, because this country has such a rich history in finance, and especially this city. I mean, I've worked a little bit in the city, a little bit in Canary Wharf. not in any sort of.
What did you do?
We don't need to go into that. It's nothing all that impressive. I've always said I've had a 20-year corporate career in self-imposed mediocrity, and let's just leave it at that. There's nothing special about it.
That's a great thing to put on your business card.
Yeah. Self-imposed mediocrity. Well, I have a theory that if you're mediocre in enough things, you become quite exceptional as a person, but not in any particular pursuit. So
look at most of the cabinet.
Well, thank you for likening me to the Labour government. Yeah. But I mean, I'm a dilettante. I just have, superficial interest in a lot of different things, and I have no interest in becoming a master of anything, to be honest.
But that's a great way to. I often think back to Victorian rectors who somehow become the world expert in the classification of a very obscure family of Lepidoptera, and at the same time they're going on holiday to Greece and stealing bits of temples and bringing them back to decorate their gardens. Like, that sounds like, I mean, you shouldn't go and steal bits of temples, but that did sound, if you were reasonably well moneyed in the Victorian era or even earlier, that sounds like an amazing life.
To have diverse interests, I've always sort of led by my curiosity, and this is, I don't think I've ever quite dedicated myself and immersed myself in any one thing like I have this. So let's see where it goes. I don't know where it's going to go, but let's see where it goes. How do we get on to that? How do we get on to me?
Sorry, I asked you what you did and you didn't want to respond. What was it?
Okay, look, project management, consulting, media, telcos, banking.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, sort of a fairly mediocre level project manager.
Right.
Yeah. I ran, interestingly enough, some of the most impactful large-scale work that I did was in my more junior days just before I came to London. So, that's probably the best work that I've ever done, because I was just given a lot of autonomy at a very senior and impactful level while still being relatively junior. So that was interesting, yeah. Funnily enough, I did a that's how I got to know the payments industry. Is before I came over here, I did a sort of payments industry project, sort of large scale pilot feasibility study, and I got to know the payment sort of value chain around about the time that PayPal was sort of not gaining traction, but I think just barely surviving death and getting a really nice, juicy buyout from eBay. So when I landed in London 2006, and then just after 3 years later, it was the financial crisis, and then Bitcoin, I should have been a really early investor in Bitcoin, and I wasn't. I'm a late 2020 and first-time investor. But I had the pedigree and I would have been just perfectly placed to understand. But what I didn't understand back then was monetary debasement, what was driving inflation. So I didn't have a problem set. I didn't have a pain point. There was no defined reason for me to think, oh, Bitcoin, I've been waiting for you all my life, sort of thing.
That's the problem with the UK, isn't it?
It is. That's the problem with the UK in a nutshell. And, just to reassure you, we all should have invested much, much earlier.
Yeah.
I look back with intense regret. 2013, this is really interesting. I should learn more about this. Forget about it for 2 years. 2015, this is fantastic. I'm going to build a computer. I'm going to start running a node. Don't buy any.
Wow.
I mean,
The thing is, I did understand Bitcoin at a superficial level, and I understood the tenuous nature of, well, what is gold backed by, and what is gold any more than just a 1,000-year custom or 5,000-year custom, and what is the US dollar backed by anyway? And I was asking all the right questions because I found my old forum posts when this came up, and so it wasn't that I wasn't prodding in the right directions. I just didn't have a pain point to go, oh yeah, I'll have a little bit of that just in case it catches on, so to speak. And I just didn't have that pain point to push me to buy it. And it was only in 2017, 2018 that I thought, if it goes down to about 200, I'll whack on 1,000 or 2 and just see what happens. And it never did go back down to 200. And so after COVID, when it bounced back after COVID, I was like, I'm not missing out on this again. This is something, I mean, if you survive one crash, maybe that's a coincidence. 2, that's starting to look serious, right? 3rd cycle, there is something of substance here. There's a movement here. And I got to understand some of the more philosophical underpinnings and also the financial mechanisms that were behind the monetary debasement, that even with the business degree and a major in finance, I consider myself miseducated on that front. And partially as a result of my miseducation in finance, I probably didn't take the Bitcoin as early as I should have because of that. Because I still thought banks were the intermediaries between savers and borrowers, and that's how loans were created, for example. I didn't realize I just went into a back room and pressed a few keys and created money. I didn't know that.
No, I didn't realize that for a very long time. There's a paper I recommend with extraordinary regularity, 2014. It's published by the Bank of England. It's called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. It's only about 10 or 15 pages long. I strongly recommend everyone has a read of that because it puts in black and white exactly what you've just described, that most money in the economy is created when banks make loans. Yeah. Which is just, I still find absolutely mind-blowing. Like you, I thought that when I deposit money into a bank, the bank goes off and lends that to someone else. And it's almost like it's not a closed loop. It's a wide open funnel, and banks are just shoveling newly created money into it. And worse than that, it's not that they're just creating new money, it's that they book that loan as an asset in their own balance sheet, and then that asset pays yield because you pay them interest for having taken the loan. Yeah. It's a genius system.
I mean, part of me thinks if I had have invested all the way back then, I probably wouldn't have started Bitcoin Archive at all. And having started Bitcoin Archive, I just think it's a perfect manifestation of my personality and my strengths as a person. Because I was saying, I have an obnoxious, extroverted personality, and finally I found a medium to channel that through. But really, I really enjoy the media aspect of this, and I can be patient and build things really slowly to last, ethically, sound principles, and doing the things that I love, and getting in touch with people that I really enjoy talking to as well. So anyway, that's enough of me. But did I answer your question? Yeah.
What you did for a living?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. We can move on now. It was because you didn't want to answer it.
Well, I don't think I'm not that interesting. So when people ask me,
it is interesting. Of course it is. Really. Yes, it is, because what led you to this point? Everybody wants to know everybody's story about what leads them to this point.
Yeah.
He's uncomfortable with being fully doxed, though. So
is that what this is?
I really don't think I'm interesting to people watching this. That's it.
But your journey is, though. Everybody's journey, what leads them to Bitcoin and when they find it. I find that fascinating for everybody.
Yeah. I think I've done an interview, though, on that.
Have you?
It's buried like 3 years old now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I did one with Nat ages ago. But yeah, like it's an old interview that I don't expect people to have sort of dragged up. It's lost in the archives somewhere on her podcast list. But I've tried not to insert myself and my story in everything that I do, because it's not really about me, and because I haven't. I just didn't want to make this, because I've seen a lot of people sort of lean into the whole delusion of becoming a prominent figure within this space and suddenly think that they're celebrities, and it makes me cringe.
Yeah.
And that's not who I am. As much as I'm extroverted, I don't want mass attention. That's not why I'm.
No, we're looking forward to when we can disappear, aren't we?
Yeah.
I'm very, very happy sitting at a computer writing stuff.
Yeah.
I see. That's the conundrum. Is as an extrovert, I've realised that I'm happiest sitting in a coffee shop with my headphones on and writing, not really being on stage or anything. But I love this, and the fact that the cameras are here are kind of like, that helps me get you here, if that makes sense, right? Because, so it's given me a platform and an opportunity to speak to lots of really interesting people, and I love that. And the cameras are just kind of incidental, really, and I'm taking advantage of that to enjoy this.
Cool.
So, yeah, I hope you don't mind my exploitation for my own personal benefit. But that's essentially what I'm doing, and it helps me serve the community in that way, which is, that's why I think it's just meant to be this way, that I wasn't an early investor, but I get the privilege of building this out and having these conversations. So I'm very grateful for that. I don't feel like I've lost out. I don't have a sense of envy of people who invested early and took those risks, because I just feel like they had the conviction they had to hold, and they did, and so they deserve all of that, and I didn't, so I don't. Yeah.
Everything happens when it should. I very much trust the process.
You do?
Yeah, 100%.
I don't trust the process at all.
I do.
Yeah.
I follow just whatever's meant to be. I used to be very regimented in what I was striving for and what I wanted to achieve, and now I really do just go with the flow and just let life take me in the direction, and I always end up finding exactly the right people that I need to speak to at exactly the right time, just by letting go of that control.
Which Greek philosopher was it? Was it Heraclitus who said, "We live in the best of all possible worlds"?
The only one.
The only one possible. What you're saying.
Yeah.
The process, Tao.
So similar idea. I hope it's Heraclitus. Otherwise, I've grotesquely slandered whoever it was who actually said it. But I think the idea is that because this is the world that exists, it has to be the best of all possible worlds, because it couldn't have been any other way.
But I think too many people try to control things. We've all had it, where you try really hard to work for something that doesn't happen, and then something absolutely brilliant finds you.
Sure. I mean, with the proviso that you're always putting your best foot forward and
with
demonstrating initiative. Yeah. So
yes.
You can't. When I speak of luck, people often think it's the kind of dumb luck that just falls into your lap. I don't mean that. I mean that there are so many variables in life that you can't anticipate and quantify all of them in advance and plan for them. But if you put your best foot forward and always initiate and push into a direction of something that you want, good things will come of that more often than not. But man, there are a lot of people who the process forgets and never delivers for too.
But maybe it does.
Yeah, it's...
Because everybody's on a different journey, aren't they?
And
we're all here to learn different things.
There is no other alternative but to believe that you have to keep pushing forward. There is no alternative to that. You can't give up.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
But that does require proof of work as well. I'm not saying that things fall into your lap because you're lucky. I'm saying you keep working hard, but you just relinquish the control.
Yes.
And go with the flow, and it will turn out better than if you try and control everything.
Yeah, the flow has taken me into some deep and dark waters over the years.
But they were probably
traumatized by them. Don't say it's probably good for you.
It is though, but it's all good for you. It's all learning experiences, and you'll find out that the whatever happened to you then will lead you to something better. You've just learnt things along the way.
Like
There's
what
no
we
such
say
thing
about
as a bad
risk.
experience. What's that, sorry?
It's like what we said earlier about risk. Maybe you were meant to lose all your money in Celsius, and you're going to learn a valuable lesson.
But you do, though. And then, but often...
Yeah, never trust Alex Mashinsky.
Yeah. No.
I still have to take deep sighs when I recall those lessons that I've learned over the years.
Would you be here now had that not happened? Probably not. Not like this. No, it had to happen like that for the good things to play out. There's always lessons, and life isn't easy. It is hard. It's hard for everybody. You just don't see those hard bits because everybody puts on a brave face.
Most of that is true, I think. I think most of that is true.
But the most interesting people that you'll meet are the ones that have gone through.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. All right. Yeah. People who do experience the highs and lows of life do become more interesting to me. I don't find people who have never struggled in life through anything at all have very little interest for me. I just find that their characters are not very relatable in any way, and they don't seem to have that introspection that gives rise to interesting conversations.
It's a really important part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I just think the process doesn't always deliver.
I think it does, just not in the way that you think it should.
Okay, that's very wise of you. Yeah.
Well, it probably depends on who you're talking about. It might not deliver for someone who experiences substance abuse and ends up homeless and dies at 45.
Yeah, I see a lot of people fall between the cracks of society and the process never delivered.
Yeah, so that...
Maybe I'm just thinking more of
in a different context.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so, yeah. I think what happened, it's really important for me to remember that things don't always work out because of who I am, as a person I am, because I'm a very confident person, you see. And so that confidence, I've probably said this on a podcast a few too many times, can bleed over into reckless risk-taking. So I've got to constantly remind myself to be vigilant about how I assess risk.
That's why, because the government will bail you out and look after you. So,
Yeah.
There's no moral hazard here.
The government will sweep in. I don't know how we got onto that. You asked me what I do for a living, and now you're giving me an existential crisis.
Sorry.
Never having a drink with you. So anyway, let's how do we get onto this?
We were
talking
chatting about
banks.
banking.
Yeah.
And then
we're talking about there are no national champions similar to Barclays and HSBC in the UK with respect to sort of the Bitcoin cryptocurrency ecosystem. We don't have a stablecoin champion, for example. They're all abroad. And so it's not just the case that the United States is such a welcoming, lovely regulatory environment because, Binance is not based in the United States, right? Tether, well, we don't really know what's happening there with respect to their headquarters, but I think they're still based in Lugano and maybe a couple of other places, right?
Binance is an interesting one as well. They don't have what's called a COMI, a centre of main interest, and that I think is deliberate from a legal perspective. They operate almost on a sort of franchise model, I suppose is a good analogy, and I suspect it's deliberate to make it very difficult to sue them. But,
yeah, well, the UK has a myriad of jurisdictions and islands that would have made that possible for a local champion as well. And I just wonder why such a case or such a champion has not arisen yet.
If I had to say it in one line, it would be the FCA. So the FCA is probably the biggest blocker to the industry and to Bitcoin generally in the country. And this is going to be a long and complicated answer, I'm afraid. But looking at it in several different ways. So the FCA has taken a number of different steps over the years to make it as difficult as possible to start a Bitcoin business in the United Kingdom, to offer Bitcoin to retail, to set yourself up as a respectable institution here who has exposure to Bitcoin in one or more different ways. A couple of concrete examples. In 2020, late 2020, early 21, the FCA forbade any retail investor buying a listed product, an ETF or an ETN, that gave them exposure to cryptocurrency in any form. Prior to that, it had been possible to do that in your ISA, but anyone who'd already done that basically had those positions frozen, and from now on they can only exit them, they can never buy back in. So there are some people who've been holding these products for like 5 years now, and the fees on them are no longer as good or as competitive as the US ones are, but they don't necessarily want to sell them because they can't buy back. So that's daft for a step. And the FCA's justification for this is that they believe that Bitcoin and crypto assets are too risky for retail investors to have exposure to. Logic subject to significant challenge there, but let's set that aside. The most egregious example of regulatory overreach, though, is in, I think, the classification of Bitcoin as a restricted mass market investment. Now, that is a definition that has a very specific legal meaning in the United Kingdom, and it means that only certain people can offer that to retail investors. Those retail investors need to, for example, if you're in the UK, your listeners will know this, go through different questionnaires and quizzes to make sure they understand the asset, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You should
No,
understand
but some of
what you're
those,
buying.
I've spoken to someone who said that those quizzes aren't even correct.
No, I've done all of them. So on my pinned tweet is a walkthrough of virtually all of them, and a lot of the stuff I completely disagree with.
Yeah.
But you need to answer the questions correctly in order to be allowed to buy the asset.
He thought he was answering the questions correctly and got locked out of Strike for life.
Possibly because he gave the correct answers. But the reason I bring that up is because the FCA had a long consultation process that we took part in, and a number of other industry participants took part in. The majority of respondents said you shouldn't categorize everything as a restricted mass market investment. For example, it doesn't really apply to Bitcoin, might apply to a crazy meme coin that some teenager created on Solana in their bedroom. And the FCA, again, I've tweeted about this in the past, it's pinned. The FCA actually said, yeah, the majority of the industry experts disagreed with us on this, so we're going to ignore them and do it anyway.
Wow.
It's infuriating.
Yeah. And so what was driving that decision? Because my next question was going to be, what are the chances of locally sponsored ETFs springing up in the United Kingdom? I guess that sounds like zero, really.
At the moment, zero. We've worked with some ETF offers. In fact, one of our early open letters to the government was highlighting the absurdity of the fact that there's a company, Jacobi Asset Management, who have had to list their note in Amsterdam out of a Guernsey entity, because they can't do it in the UK. And the UK used to be a great jurisdiction to list in.
So ETPs are listed in Germany, they're listed in Amsterdam, Spain?
I think so, yes,
Yeah.
and also in Hong Kong. So we are literally being left behind. The FCA just relented last year, so some exchange-traded notes are now listed on the London Stock Exchange. But we missed the boat. The capital has flowed elsewhere, and retail investors still can't access those. So you have to ask...
For what gain? That's what I always ask myself is, okay, we've done that. What have we gained from that? Nothing.
Well, nothing. If you'd invested in an ETF in 2020... God knows what's the price done since like March 2020.
So we've now, ETFs in the United States were approved on January 11th or 12th in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
So we've now had...
and they went up 100%. That Bitcoin went up 100% in that time frame. So
16 months of inflows. The most wildly successful ETF launch in history. The most successful. Sponsored by, mainstream Wall Street institutions. We've had that much time to set an example for the FCA to change its mind, and yet they're still obstinate.
Well, one theory is that the turnover of staff is too high. So once they understand what they're dealing with, they leave.
They go into industry, or what do they do?
Set up their own companies.
And there was also, you were also actively encouraged to leave if you thought that cryptocurrency and Bitcoin were good things. So I'm talking quite a few years back now. There was a general policy from on high within the organization that if you liked it, you should perhaps find a job elsewhere. And as Susie says, a lot of people who did like it suddenly thought, hell, I'm going to set up a another business, and Susie's got some inside intel.
What
on that.
kind of businesses have they been setting up? Are we talking like consultancy lobbying firms, or are they actual businesses within the industry?
I probably have said more than I should have already.
Tell us, Susie.
No, I can't.
I think saying actual
Open my
businesses is fair
personal
enough.
history.
And setting up commercial businesses is fair enough. That's not breaching any form of confi. And there's also the utter absurdity that there was a general policy that if you held cryptocurrency, you couldn't then work on it because you had a conflict of interest. The example I always use is it's like trying to get driving lessons from someone who's only ever seen a picture of a car.
Yeah.
Well, it's because it's treating Bitcoin as if it's a security. I mean, does the Minister for Housing have a home?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
So
you can't understand the asset properly unless you've used it. I mean, all you need to do is declare it. Download a wallet of Satoshi and just play around with it. See what the properties of the asset are, understand them properly, and then it's impossible to write good regulation unless you fully understand what it is that you're regulating. And a lot of the regulators at the moment seem to think that this is an asset that behaves like other assets. And, our messaging is, this is nothing to be frightened about. It's an asset and a protocol and a piece of code and a transaction record that have certain properties and behave in certain ways. These are those properties and these are those ways. It's nothing to get your knickers in a twist over. But the knickers have been very, very twisted into a horrible knot over the last few years.
So when I look at the United States and how progress has been made over there, it's essentially, okay, Trump cannot really be considered an outsider as a former president and now current president. But I see that a lot of progress has been made with the states, municipalities, university pension funds, that sort of thing, that are below the federal level, that operate sort of on the ground, right? And they have, but we don't really have states here. We have councils, right? Essentially, boroughs. But what is the light at the end of the tunnel? Do we have individuals in parliament and in government who are receptive, but perhaps a lone voice at the moment? Are we
beginning to see it?
Yeah.
So we've put on a couple of events over the last couple of years, and it was interesting, Susie, I think, to compare the guest list from our first one to the most recent one. So the first one,
and the people coming to speak as well.
Well, yeah. So that's about the speaker lists.
Yeah.
So,
but even the attendees too.
Yeah, exactly. So at our most recent one, we had Andrew Griffith, whom I mentioned earlier, who's now the shadow business secretary. We had Steve Baker, ex-MP. We had Isabella Kaminska, who was a journalist at the FT.
What is she now?
She now runs her own platform. She's still in journalism.
My recollection is she was quite skeptical.
She was,
and mockingly so.
Yeah.
And how's that changed?
She's got a really interesting story. So I actually read her Bitcoin stuff for years and years, and I thought she was a great writer, really clever. Disagreed with her on Bitcoin, and it's been fascinating to see the evolution of her understanding of it. And I think she has a similar backstory in some respects to mine. I obviously grew up in Zimbabwe, a country with a collapsing currency, and it was easy for me, I think, to understand the benefit of a money that the government can't control and can't debase and can't inflate away. Her family, I think, was Polish, and so she has experience of her family living behind the Iron Curtain. And so she calls her perspective that of a doom coiner. So you wouldn't necessarily use Bitcoin every day in the UK because we have a stable financial system, but it might be useful to have some just in case everything goes to shit and we hit hyperinflation and currency debasement becomes aggressively accelerated, which I think is a really interesting evolution to go from, as you rightly say, a complete skeptic writing for the Financial Times, which is itself probably the most skeptical paper about Bitcoin in the country, and then evolving to being an independent journalist with quite an interesting opinion. I don't know what your perspective on.
I just think people that are able to change their minds and go on that journey are definitely worth listening to.
Yeah, I don't want to be dismissive of a change of mind, but I wonder how much of it has got to do with sort of harvesting an audience from the Bitcoin crowd now that she's running an independent.
I think she's genuine.
Yeah. Okay. I hope so.
Yeah.
And I'm open to that. I'm just being little bit cynical.
No, it's right to be cynical.
Yes, of course.
But she's not a cheerleader for Bitcoin.
No.
It's that in certain contexts she can see that it might be useful.
You know what? And you don't have to be. I don't need people to become cheerleaders of Bitcoin. I interviewed a guy the other day. I won't mention who he is, but I told you off camera.
Oh,
yeah. And I interviewing him solely because of his expertise, and I've been a follower of his for a long time in the health and fitness space. And then we're just halfway through the conversation, and he just lets slip that he's a Bitcoiner, and he doesn't go on Twitter and post about it, and he's not getting into arguments and living his life through Bitcoin Twitter. He's bought it for the sole reason that, if things, as an insurance policy, if things go bad, I'm covered. I've got a little bit. I don't even focus on it. All I focus on is my business, my family, my life. And that's essentially, the ideal place that you want to get to.
How do you buy Bitcoin and not get obsessed with it? That's the thing.
Well, he's got quite a lot to be obsessed with. He's one of the most innovative people in fitness at the moment in the world, and has been for about 4 or 5 years. And his story is fascinating. I can't wait to publish his story. I mean, his story is well known, but our interview together, I can't wait to publish it because people will be surprised. And I think it's an example to us all that Bitcoin is something that we can be obsessed about, and it's a movement that is worth investing your time and effort into. But let's not forget that there is also a life to be lived as well.
I'm struggling to find that balance.
Read more of Stack Hodler's posts.
He's amazing.
I like the way he writes.
He is amazing. Yeah, I've had the pleasure of meeting him a few years ago. Yeah, and this was when he was, I wouldn't say he didn't have any followers. He probably had 15,000 followers back then, 10 or 15,000. And I'd noticed his work, and I may have even been following, but he reached out and he's like, "Hey, I heard you're coming to such place." And I said, "Yes, I am. Let's catch up for a drink." And I'm like, "Okay, who's this guy?" Right? He could be anyone at that point, right? Because he wasn't writing as prolifically at that time. So I met up with him. He's a great guy, really good guy, and just reminds people, actually, Bitcoin is great and everything, but you've got to remember there's a life to be lived as well. And look, Bitcoin can take up a large part of that, but I think some people online lose sight of the need to maintain a healthy balance and to have something outside of this domain to balance you out as a person and to just give you perspective. Because some people think the timeline is life, and it's not. They literally think that, they act like it's life and death here on the timeline, and it's not. It's not that at all.
And the ultimate goal, in some respects, is to live in a world where you no longer have to think about Bitcoin, and there are no Bitcoin podcasts, and there's no Bitcoin Twitter.
And we're obsolete.
Banish the thought.
Yes. No. Obviously, let that time not happen until after your retirement. But
we shall multiply.
Yes. You ultimately want just Bitcoin to be operating in the background, doing its thing, because at that point, the battle will have been won.
I think there will always be a role for a community, a vigilant community, because it is essentially a social construct around a protocol that needs to be maintained over time. Otherwise, it can be corrupted.
Yes.
So I agree with that.
And co-opted, and I think we're kind of seeing that.
Well, the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of patriots.
We can go into that, but we can definitely go into that. But I think as an individual, so as a community, that's absolutely necessary. But as an individual, we should always remember to add balance to our lives. And it's okay to have periods of focus and obsession, but to just constantly go back into life.
Yeah, I try not to look at my phone at the weekends if it's at all possible.
Yeah, and I say this as someone totally immersed in all of this. So this is as much of a reminder for me as anybody watching and listening to this. Suze, you mentioned co-opting. It's been a point of discussion. And I guess, there's a little bit of a contradiction in the community because it seems that at least in public discussion, the people who are most vocal seem to have a political persuasion that's more libertarian than anything else. And on the other hand, they have objections to people using their choice to acquire as much Bitcoin as possible. And so it's like, for me, I don't know how to reconcile the two. Like, you're either free for anybody to buy Bitcoin as much as they want, or you don't want people to have that freedom and you want to limit that. So there's nothing you can really do.
Or you can just dislike it and accept it. That's okay too, isn't it?
Sure.
So I understand that Sailor has a choice to buy as much as he likes, but every time he buys, I don't think, I think,
I wish he'd stop.
Yeah, exactly. That's
leave
exactly
some
what
for
I
everyone
think.
else.
Yeah.
I think there will only be one MicroStrategy,
Yes.
and nobody will come close to that.
No.
And the next is essentially, and nobody really talks about BlackRock and GBTC all that much, but Grayscale is still a huge holder of
That
Bitcoin.
surprises me. Because they're expensive, aren't they? I mean, their
Very
fees.
expensive, yeah.
Why would anyone?
I think there are tax implications for people selling out. So some people have done the calculation that if we sell, we might have to pay 30% upfront.
Okay.
But if we hold, sure, we're paying an extra percentage every year in management fees. But by the time we do sell in 5 or 10 years' time, that tax component that I would have paid today will compound over that period of time. So why should I pay the taxman now?
That
when I
makes
can
more
just
sense.
use
Yeah, I
that
hadn't thought of
capital?
it like that. Yeah.
So I guess I'm only guessing. I don't understand all the tax implications.
So I
but
thought
that's
once
how
the
I'd be
ETFs
thinking.
came out that Grayscale would die.
Yeah. Well, they also have released they've launched the GBTC Mini with much lower fees. And so for people who like doing business with Grayscale, but don't mind the tax implication, or they don't really have much of a tax burden once they do sell. So recent buyers, they can just move their funds into Grayscale and continue doing business with Grayscale. So I think that's and it's not an insignificant size, the mini one either. It's got quite a bit. But the GBTC the outflows seem to have tapered off and stabilized now. But so, we've got MicroStrategy. Clearly, they're onto a winning strategy there. Like their formula is absolutely working for the acquisition of accumulation of Bitcoin. That's working for them. And then BlackRock, anytime the Bitcoin price sort of shoots up, they just have an unending appetite from their clients to buy more and more.
Yeah, and you look at how much they're buying, and obviously the issuance is only 450 a day. I mean, was it Checkmate just recently put out something about supply crunch? It's something that I've been writing about for a long time.
I don't know. I'd be surprised if he used that term because he's been quite disparaging.
No, he has. And I had a chat with him at Cheat Code about it as well. And he was actually saying how there's almost no way to know what's available left on exchanges. But he did recently just put something out on his Substack about it. But it stands to reason that there's going to be, and he did not use that term. You're right. I'm using that term. But it's going to happen because you can see that thousands are being bought, an average of thousands are being bought every single day. And there's only 450 coming into the system. So
there'd have to be some kind of inflection point.
Have to be.
With the price.
Especially if they,
to induce more,
and this
more
is
supply.
early. Like I keep doing that with the thing. We are still early. So once BlackRock come out and say, right, 1 to 3% of your portfolios need to be allocated, and then nation states start buying it, and then it becomes normalized.
The UK will be the last.
Of course, yeah. So, so when we're at a stage where not many people are taking it seriously. Well, what happens when everybody's taking it seriously?
So I'm going to do an analysis of MicroStrategy and now Strategy's acquisition rate when I get a little bit of time. But it's only accelerating, right?
Yeah.
And so the prospects of them getting to 1 million Bitcoin are very real.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the potential, yet not confirmed, for the United States to buy 1 million Bitcoin as well. Then we have in the background, I mean, someone's confirmed to me that apparently China, the government, is mining Bitcoin.
Yeah,
of course.
Russia is as well.
Russia.
It's
The UAE.
well, the three largest, the hash rate, the US, then Russia, and then China.
It makes complete sense. I've long
Or China
been
and
of the
Russia.
view that we're beginning to see great power competition
Yes.
over both hash rate and accumulation.
Yeah, right. Which is why we need to start using it more. For the demand response, it's a complete no-brainer. We've got 0.1% of the hash power.
So hash price at the moment is what, 130,000 or something?
It's
way ahead of the actual price.
It is.
So that can only be sustained one way, right? You need virtually free energy to sustain that. And so who could do that, right?
Lots of nice cheap hydropower in China and lots of free gas in Russia.
Or if you're flaring gas is the only way I could see a commercial entity saying, well, we're flaring that anyway, so we might as well just use that.
Yeah, stick a miner on.
Yeah, exactly.
Or heating solutions.
I want to get back to co-opting. What are the risks of co-opting, do you think? Because we've mentioned, I think the social aspects of social influence of organizations that have acquired large amounts of Bitcoin could be a potential risk. But I don't think that's a very realistic one at the moment because, for example, Michael Saylor is hugely influential, right? But is he really influential enough to push any change to the protocol that is against the interest? I don't think he is.
No.
And I think people are jumping at shadows a little bit on that.
Theoretically, you could censor transactions if the US got to over 50% of the hash rate. Theoretically, it has been done. Marathon did
So it will be forked then, right? And then all the Ideological plebs, maxis will go with one fork versus the other.
No. I don't think it will be forked. I think that I'm not saying it will happen.
No.
I'm just saying theoretically they could censor transactions.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the crux of the risk as I identify it. So I've always been much more worried about Bitcoin's censorship resistance than Bitcoin's privacy, for example. We know it's got actually relatively poor privacy, but censorship resistance is absolutely fundamental to its basic properties as a money. And we know already that it was Marathon, wasn't it? You mentioned running OFAC-compliant transactions, not including transactions that have blacklisted addresses in their block templates. I tend to be slightly more optimistic, I think, than you, Susie, on this, in that I suspect this, because we're beginning to see great power competition, as long as the great powers remain oppositional to each other, I suspect, and this is just a theory, it's not proven, I suspect we would always see sufficient hash rate in effectively nation-state enemies to allow transactions to be included within a block mined by one of your enemies.
Yes.
So because Bitcoin is such an antagonistic system, I hope that's always going to remain the case, but you do raise a real risk of...
I think it's a short-term risk that will sort itself out in the long term.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But I still think it's a short-term risk that people need to be more aware of.
That it could be an acute problem, but such is the ecosystem that it will balance out over the medium to longer term.
Yes.
I suspect, and if it becomes an acute problem, not that I want to encourage our nation state enemies to be transacting, but they're people too. So let's say we were only including OFAC compliant transactions in our blocks. There's a strong incentive for them to start mining using their free gas or their free hydropower so that they can get their transactions through. So I hope that even if it did become acute, and again this is just theorizing, the problem would fix itself.
But it's still something to be aware of, as 40% of that hash rate is in the US. And we know that Trump is talking about mining all the Bitcoins, and he talks about, what did Saylor suggest? Buying 20 or 25% of the network?
He was suggesting up to 4 or 5 million Bitcoin.
Right. So,
this is a bit of a silly comment, but at some point, if Saylor's the only person who owns any Bitcoin, doesn't that mean that it's value
Sorry,
proposition is gone?
That was for the United States government to purchase that much over the next 25, 30 years.
It was his recommendation, so that they owned a large section of the network that's basically going to become the unofficial reserve currency of the world.
Fine, yeah. I mean, I think the other.
It was point, he only said it. It was only words. They're not.
Yeah. No, I hope he does.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that's it's so important is that when you're thinking about the decentralization of the system, obviously geographical hash rate decentralization, where the jurisdictions applicable to where the hash rate is being deployed, and then also how the protocol is controlled. So obviously a 51% attack is not necessarily the same contextually as who's doing the mining and where the mining is being done.
No.
So another very important thing that we often encounter is explain to someone why the 21 million cap can't be changed, and then thinking, what does it take? What kind of consensus do you need in order to make those protocol changes? And then the recursive property of Bitcoin, which is that if you have a lot of Bitcoin, why would you be incentivized to push through a change that would diminish the value proposition of what you own. So the enlightened self-interest of the system is obviously beautiful in terms of preserving that. But having said that, if there is I think it's a remote risk that you would see an attempt to co-opt decision-making ability, and that I think would only come from a hostile nation state, not from a commercial owner of the Bitcoin. Because if you're a commercial owner of the Bitcoin, the price is going up, you're happy.
It is, but the concentrated wealth could be an issue.
But then if your wealth is concentrated in Bitcoin, you don't want to make you wouldn't change the hard cap, would you?
No.
So because that would destroy your value prop.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that because it's Satoshi's genius in...
But then we see the same thing happening with the United States dollar, where effectively the United States in the Biden administration, it stretches back. I guess Obama started that as well. We're using the global payment system as a financial weapon, US dollar financials. So it's like you would have thought that they'd be sensible enough to understand that sanctioning Russia, China, seizing their assets would encourage them, and Iran as well, would encourage them to seek alternative methods.
Of course.
And then undermine the hegemony of US dollar as the global reserve, or US treasuries as the global reserve asset. But, they've done that anyway. And so now we have 3 countries openly seeking alternative methods to settle international trade. In the first instance, directly between their currencies, but also amongst commercial entities using various, quotation marks, blockchain solutions.
Well, they wanted to back it by commodities, didn't they?
Yeah. So I think Russia has given permission for Bitcoin settled transactions.
Yep.
Maybe Iran too, but they haven't really made a big song and dance.
It was always going to happen, though. It was inevitable.
Sure.
I wrote about this in May 23, actually, about how it was going to be the only obvious, because you can't weaponize money and expect there to be no consequences to that.
Well, for the longest time, they have weaponized it, and there weren't, but they haven't realized that technological advance has just left them behind. Like their sanctions are not as potent as they used to be.
No.
And also the world is truly multipolar now.
Because when they did sanction Russia, the impression I got from Putin at the time was it was just like he just shrugged and just went, I ain't bothered. he just didn't.
Russia had prepared for it for a very long time.
He knew what they were going to do, and he knew how he was going to handle it.
Well, they had built, for example, a domestic equivalent of the Visa rails to use for, as soon as they were frozen out of that system. They'd been accumulating gold for a long time.
A lot of oil.
Yep, and they've connected their payment systems now. I think they've done, in the last 18 months, they did tests with Iran, also tests with China, and they're fully compatible now. And so their cards issued in Russia can work in China, no problem. Yeah.
Because if I was Putin, I would just not export my oil and I'd just mine Bitcoin.
Well, what they've done is they've just gone in a roundabout way. So India, for example, has been a huge buyer of Russian oil and then a huge exporter of that oil, right? So that's been, and look, the world can't survive without Russian oil, I'm afraid, right? Unless you want the price to go through the roof. And Western powers don't really want that, right? So they want to sanction Russia, but they don't really want to bear the consequences of those sanctions. Go ahead.
Oh, no, just occurred to me, something, maybe your pet topic, on the subject of international sanctions and freezing people out, and the US maybe having overstepped the mark in terms of dollar hegemony. Stablecoins, particularly US ones, I think, and we've seen that in the UK legislation as well. There was quite a lot written this week about stablecoins in the piece of legislation that came out. I think we're kind of the view that encouraging the use and dissemination of stablecoins is probably quite a clever way of ensuring that the US dollar remains the dominant global currency. And I suspect, again, without a huge amount of direct evidence yet, that this lies behind a lot of the sudden approval, the increase in the approval ratings for stablecoins coming out of the US.
Well, it backs US treasuries by 85%.
Treasury's a systemically important buyer of treasuries now, isn't it? It was something like number 8 in the world.
Tether is. Yes, yes. So I thought they'd been quite explicit about that recently, but maybe not so. But I thought the signals coming out of the administration were clear that they're going to be friendly to US dollar stablecoins because of the benefits of them buying US treasuries, but they're going to introduce regulation that mandates that they purchase US dollar treasuries if they're going to issue US dollar stablecoins. And so essentially that's like a bear hug, isn't it? Like, we'll give you our approval, but you've got to give us the money. And so
but that's your point, though, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's like a perfect circle then.
Yeah, it's going to happen. I think that's a recognised benefit. Guys, I'm conscious of the fact that time flies, and some of us have hard stops on leaving today. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you both. It's been a fascinating conversation. I love the work that you're doing. If I can support you in any way, please reach out. Okay, and I'll do my best. So thanks again for coming in. It's been a great discussion, and let's do this again sometime.
We'd love to. Brilliant. And we love your work, and it's an honour to be here with you. Thank you.
And just before we go, tell people where they can find you.
So you can go to our X account, just look up Bitcoin Policy UK, or go to our website. I actually recommend you go and look at the policy page, because then you'll see all of Freddie's proof of work over the past 2 years and all of his letters and consultations, which is pretty phenomenal. Or you can find me on X if you just look up Suze.
Spell that for us.
Can you put it in the show notes?
Oh, okay. We will put it in the show notes.
Right.
Yeah, we'll definitely.
I'd have to write it down and then read it back to myself.
It's all right. Never mind. Freddie?
Everything Susie said, and I'm easy to find on Twitter. I'm just at Freddie New, Freddie with a double D and IE. And I'm also on Nostr. My NPub is in my X or Twitter handle.
Oh, yeah, also on Nostr, yeah.
You're on Nostr as well?
Of course.
Oh, cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for having us.
Awesome.